They said the church was built with prayers, but beneath the altar, they buried bodies. Twin girls, 9 years old. Identical faces, identical voices. And they knew things no child ever should. Before we go any further, understand this: what you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not some campfire story to scare the weak. This is a true account, pulled from historical journals, buried legal records, and testimonies whispered for nearly 2 centuries. It's a mystery so deep, so disturbingly precise, that not even modern science dares explain it. And yet, every word verified. This is the case of the Morrison twins, 2 little girls who walked into a forgotten church in the hills of Kentucky in 1834 and left behind a trail of shattered realities, broken men, and the unsettling question: can the dead speak through the living? And if so, who decides what truths are revealed? It begins in Pine Hollow, a place so isolated that even the maps of the day barely acknowledged its existence. A sleepy Baptist congregation tucked between mountains, guarded by wilderness, and protected by silence. The kind of silence that's chosen, the kind that hides secrets. Dark ones. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived there in late autumn, carrying 2 daughters and a leather-bound Bible, worn thin from decades of use. But it wasn't his sermons that changed the town forever. It was the girls, Rebecca and Rachel. They didn't just talk. They remembered things no one had ever told them, things no one should have known, like the exact location of a bottle hidden under the church floor, a bottle the local pastor buried in shame, or the names of men who had quietly skimmed church donations, or the color of a dress a little girl wore the night she died 16 years before the twins were born. They didn't whisper prophecies. They spoke truths, sealed secrets, shocking scenes. And they did it with the unblinking clarity of a messenger who doesn't fear the storm, because they are the storm. But this isn't just about creepy kids with eerie visions. No, it goes much deeper. Because what those girls unearthed wasn't just personal shame or buried regret. It was a system built on silence, sanctified by scripture, and washed in blood. In the old church, beneath the very floorboards where the congregation prayed and confessed, the bones of murdered men lay mixed with stone and soil, their voices long ignored, until Rebecca and Rachel came and began to speak for them. But how did they know? That's what makes this story so dangerous, because it opens the door to a reality few are willing to accept. A world where time doesn't protect secrets, and the soul, that eternal witness, cannot be silenced by death. These children were not just touched by something beyond this world. They were instruments of something older than fear, something no religion, no science, no philosophy has ever truly explained. Call it divine judgment. Call it psychic echo. Call it a curse handed down from sins too great to forget. But understand this: if you choose to go further into this story, you may not look at the world the same way again, because every town has its Pine Hollow, every family has its forgotten Whitmans, and every soul carries something they were told to bury. This isn't fiction, it's forbidden history, and history has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. You ready to dig? Because what we uncover next will change youth. First time the girls spoke, no one believed them. Not really. Not until the woman dropped her spoon. The Morrison family had just arrived after a brutal trek through the soaked mountain trails. Rachel had a fever. Rebecca clung to her father's coat. Ezekiel, tired, worn, but steady, introduced himself with humble reverence. The church elders nodded, offered shelter. Just another traveling preacher and his daughters. Then came dinner. Rebecca, bright-eyed, with a strange calmness, looked across the table and asked Pastor Philip's wife about her roses. Not the ones in bloom, the ones that died. Did the roses by the eastern fence survive the blight 3 summers ago? The spoon hit the floor. Silence, because 3 summers ago, there had been a blight. It had ruined the entire flower bed. A private grief, spoken of only once, years back, in whispers. It wasn't public, it wasn't known. Rebecca just smiled and said, "I dreamed of them, while walking." That moment, that tiny fracture in the reality they all agreed to believe, was the first crack. But it wouldn't be the last. The next morning, Rachel stood in the doorway, her fever all but gone, her voice small but sure. "In your church, beneath the third floorboard from the altar," she told Pastor Phillips, "there's something hidden that shouldn't be there." Phillips tried to laugh it off, but she was insistent. Rebecca joined her. A bottle, brown glass, wrapped in a baby's blanket. That's when Phillips dropped his spoon, because it was true. All of it. The bottle, the cloth, a scrap from the blanket of the son he'd lost in infancy. The secret shame he buried 3 months ago, hoping temptation might be easier to resist if he kept it close, rather than face it. No one else knew. Only God, and 2 little girls who shouldn't. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He'd seen it before. "It started when they were very young," he said. "At first I thought it was intuition, but then the dreams began. Dreams of places they'd never been, names they'd never heard, crimes long hidden, regrets long buried. And every single time, the details were verifiably true. This wasn't vague mysticism or emotional guessing. This was precision. It wasn't prophecy. It was forensic memory of a life they never lived. On Sunday, it happened again, this time in front of the entire congregation. After Ezekiel's sermon, the twins moved through the crowd, gently, kindly, with voices like water slipping through cracks in stone. To one man, they mentioned the church funds he'd been skimming to cover private debt. To another, they spoke of the attic where he hid his disabled son. To a teenage boy, they named the married woman he was secretly meeting behind the mill. Every secret, every shame, exposed, casually, innocently, no judgment, just facts, as if they were reading from a ledger kept by someone else. And then Rebecca walked to the altar, laid her tiny hand on the wooden cross, looked up. "This is sacred ground," she said, "but it's been stained. The Whitman family," she whispered, "didn't die in a house fire." The air went still. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. "They died here," she continued, "in this room, behind that altar. And some of you know why. No one moved, no one breathed, because the Whitmans were supposed to be a tragedy of the past, a fire, an accident, long mourned and buried." But as Rebecca spoke, the older faces turned pale, and suddenly, a memory returned, a whispered suspicion, a buried shame. Elder Thompson stood, barely able to walk, his wife gripping his arm in terror. What are you saying, child?" Rebecca didn't blink. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her shoulder," she said. "Hope wore a silver locket with her mother's hair. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress. Hope was in her nightgown." She paused, looked straight into Thompson's soul. "They weren't alone when they died. Someone found them here and made sure they never told what they knew." From the pews, murmurs, gasps, a sudden wave of sickness rising in those who had lived with the lie. A woman whispered, "There were bloodstains years later, on the floor. We scrubbed, but a doctor added, I found bones in the foundation wall when we rebuilt it." And Pastor Phillips, he simply sat, frozen, realizing what he'd been standing over every Sunday for 5 years. This wasn't a church, it was a tomb, and now, the dead had found their voice. The line between madness and revelation is thinner than most realize. It isn't loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers, and in that small, creaking church in Pine Hollow, the whisper became a storm. Rebecca and Rachel stood in front of the congregation, not with fury, not with fire, but with the calm certainty of a judge who doesn't need to raise their voice to pass sentence. Their faces still, their hands clasped, as if holding on to something invisible, and one by one, the cracks began to widen. Elder Thompson's wife collapsed into her pew, muttering prayers that hadn't passed her lips in years. Samuel Turner, once proud, once polished, buried his face in his hands. Dr. Hayes looked as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. And the pastor, once the shepherd of this quiet flock, sat unmoving, his soul unraveling thread by thread. It was Rachel who spoke next. There was a meeting, she said. Late, angry. Jacob Whitman begged them to stop, begged them to confess. Her voice was soft, almost kind, but the words pierced like cold steel. He said, if they didn't tell the truth, he would. The church creaked under the weight of memory. Every eye was on them, but the girls weren't finished. They followed him that night, Rachel continued. He brought Mary and the twins here to be safe, he thought. The altar would protect them. Rebecca's voice rose, not in anger, but like thunder rolling quietly across distant hills. But it didn't. Silence, thick, dreadful, until Elder Thompson finally stood again. This time, not to object, not to deny, but to break. She's right, he whispered. They're right. His words were weak, but the weight they carried crushed the room. We told ourselves it was necessary, he said. We told ourselves the Whitmans were a threat to everything we built. But you didn't build it, Rebecca said. She turned to the congregation now, her eyes brighter than they should be. You took it. A silence followed, not empty, but filled with the sound of every man and woman in that room, remembering what they had chosen to forget. And then the voice of Rachel again. Jacob found something, she said. He didn't want to, but he saw too much. He saw the shoes, Rebecca added, the horses, the blood on the saddle that didn't belong to anyone from Pine Hollow. She turned her face toward Pastor Phillips. The money to build this church didn't come from donations, did it? No answer, because the answer was already known. It came from travelers, she whispered. Men passing through the valley. Some never made it to where they were going, but their money did. The entire congregation froze in a single breathless instant. It was Samuel Turner who broke the silence this time, the same man who'd once led the community's harvest prayers. My grandfather told me once that some men disappeared in 18 and 19. They said it was wolves, accidents, but he never looked me in the eye when he said it. And then, like a dam breaking, it all began to pour out. One woman remembered the strange, blood-stained clothes found near the creek. Another recalled the night a man rode in asking about his brother and was turned away before sunrise. A third spoke of how her father had returned from a hunting trip with far more gold than meat. Piece by piece, the skeleton of a secret. A system was unearthed. Rebecca looked up at the wooden cross above the altar. Jacob Whitman tried to stop it, but he was silenced, along with Mary, along with faith and hope, and the babies. The room erupted. Babies. Someone cried. Rachel stepped forward. Mary Whitman was 8 months pregnant, with twins. They died too, and for the first time, truly the first, the congregation believed. This wasn't superstition. It wasn't trickery. It was truth. Raw, awful, and far too detailed to be imagined. The dreams weren't dreams. They were memories. And not just the Morrison twins' memories, but the memories of children who had died in silence, who refused to stay silent any longer. Ezekiel Morrison finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. They carry more than visions. They carry burdens, truths too heavy for most of us to bear. He looked out over the stunned faces. But once you hear them, you can never go back to the way things were. That night, the town of Pine Hollow didn't sleep. Doors stayed locked, candles burned low, and nightmares took new shape. But it wasn't fear of the twins that haunted them. It was the realization that their entire world had been built on the backs of the forgotten, the murdered, the silenced, and now, the dead were speaking, and what they had to say would bring an empire of lies crashing to the ground by dawn. Pine Hollow was no longer a town. It was a wound, and the girls, they were no longer children, at least. Not in the eyes of the people who had heard them speak the previous day. Rebecca and Rachel. Morrison had taken something sacred, the illusion of peace, and shattered it with a single truth. This church was built on murder, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. 3 bodies buried beneath the sanctuary floor. Bones mixed with the very stone that held the altar upright. Not a rumor, not a ghost story. Verified, they dug them up, and what they found broke whatever disbelief remained. A gold ring, initials etched into its worn metal. A copper cross, snapped at the chain. A silver-handled knife, still stained. Artifacts once belonging to men, declared missing by the outside world, now proven to have been buried by Pine Hollow itself. Pastor Phillips watched in silence as each item was catalogued, each skull brushed clean. These were not thieves, not attackers. They were travelers, preachers, surveyors, men whose only mistake was crossing into the wrong valley at the wrong time. It was the girls who knew where to dig, without hesitation, without error. Rebecca stood over one site and said, "Here," Rachel said, 3 feet down, and that's where the truth was found. The men began to question how it was possible. How could 2 9-year-old girls name the dead, locate hidden graves, describe faces they had never seen? The answer was the one no one wanted to hear. They don't guess, Ezekiel Morrison said. They remember. But from who? That was the question that haunted them most. Because every time the girls spoke, they weren't just telling stories. They were channeling someone else's pain. Every secret they revealed came with a cost. Rachel's nosebleeds, Rebecca's nightmares. The 1,000-yard stare that left them hollow when the revelations became too much. It wasn't performance. It was possession, not by demons, not by spirits, exactly, but by the weight of what had been ignored for too long. Pastor Phillips, in private, wept into his Bible. He had stood above these graves, offered blessings, buried children of his own beside the walls of this same church. And now he knew. The floor beneath his feet was not holy. It was hallowed by blood. He returned to the old records, the early entries, the sermons from his predecessor, Pastor Hayes, and in them, he found the truth, hiding in plain sight. A single line, buried in a page otherwise filled with scripture. Lord, forgive us. They came to the church for sanctuary, but found only silence. That wasn't about repentance. It was about complicity. Phillips kept reading, candlelight flickering over yellowed pages. Hayes had known, not just about the Whitmans, about all of it, the travelers, the stolen money, the unmarked graves, the false blessings. And Hayes had written his final journal entry with trembling hands. If a foundation is laid with blood, no prayer can cleanse it. Phillips closed the book. His hands shook, because he knew now his ministry had been a lie. He hadn't been saving souls. He'd been standing on their corpses. But still, the question remained. How could the girls know? Theories spread like wildfire. Some said the twins were witches, that their mother, dead in childbirth, had cursed them, that their knowledge was unnatural, a punishment sent to expose the impure. Others believed it was divine, that God had sent the girls as prophets, messengers of truth, to cleanse what had been corrupted. But Ezekiel Morrison, he didn't speculate, he didn't explain, he simply stood beside his daughters, his weathered hand on their backs, and said, "They don't seek out the pain, it finds them, and the truth." It wasn't done finding them yet, because just when Pine Hollow thought it had unearthed its final syntha, girls spoke again, and what they said next shattered what was left of the town's soul. The church was quiet. Now, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that comes after something terrible has been revealed, and no one dares speak in case the walls start bleeding. It was Rachel who broke the silence, her voice so soft, most didn't hear it at first. There were more. Elder Thompson lifted his head. More. Rebecca nodded. Mary Whitman wasn't just a mother, she was pregnant, 8 months along, with twins, the same way Rebecca and Rachel had come into the world, so had faith and hope. Except the Whitman sisters never had the chance to be born. The gasps came slowly, scattered like raindrops. A woman clutched her chest. A young man dropped his prayer book. Someone whispered, "No, they died, too," Rachel said. They were inside her when she ran into the church. She thought the altar would keep them safe. Pastor Phillips, already broken, stood motionless. Ezekiel bowed his head. Even the wind outside seemed to retreat from the windows. "They cry," Rebecca said. "Not loud, just waiting, like they don't know where to go." A sound rose from the back, a cry that did not come from a child, but from an old woman with too many deaths buried in her memory. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "That's why the soil never grew right. That's why the garden turned black." The church wasn't just stained by blood, it was poisoned by it. That floor, that altar, those stones, they weren't just a place of silence. They were a cradle and a grave. Judge Harrison arrived that evening, a man of the law, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, only evidence. He'd come for answers. What he found was a reckoning. He questioned the girls, alone, separately, and both told the exact same things. The names, the burial sites, the details of a minister's gold watch cracked from a fall. The letters an abandoned wife kept hidden for 15 years. The dreams of a child buried inside a womb who never got to breathe. Judge Harrison's skepticism turned into fear, because facts don't lie, and neither, it seemed, did these girls. The next morning, under the judge's orders, they began to dig behind the church. In the old foundation, by Devil's Creek, every location the girls identified revealed something buried. Bones, artifacts, forgotten things once touched by blood, and then hidden under soil and prayer. That evening, when the remains of Marcus Webb were unearthed, pocket watch and all, the courtroom was moved into the church. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They sat where sermons had been preached over the bones of innocent men, and now justice would be spoken in the same air. Elder Thompson confessed, tears soaking into the wooden floor. He named names: Samuel Bradford, Marcus Perry, himself. And then, just as silence threatened to return, Rebecca turned toward the judge. "There's something else," she said. The judge paused. "Something else?" "Yes," Rachel answered. "The mine shaft." Everyone knew of the shaft, abandoned, rotting, a scar in the hills. But the girls knew what it really was. They threw the bodies in, to hide them. The sheriff didn't wait. By dusk, his men were halfway up the trail with shovels, and then came the final moment of descent. As if everything before was only a prelude, Rebecca stepped forward, looked out across the room. Her voice shook for the first time. "There are others." The words hung there. "Not from the past," she said. Now, Pine Hollow didn't just have a dark past. It had a living, breathing rot in its present. The system had never ended. The methods had changed, the silence had stayed the same, and the crimes had simply learned to wear new faces. There are moments in a man's life when the truth opens like a knife. This was one of them, and for the men still listening, still watching, it's time for you to lock this truth into your own blood. Go to the comments right now and write this: "The bones remember. The silence never lasts." Write it twice. Seal it, because you're not just watching a story anymore. You're part of it. You've heard what wasn't meant to be heard, seen what was buried, and if you leave now, the silence wins again. But stay, and we'll go deeper, because what we uncover next rewrites everything you thought you knew about life, death, and the secrets this world hides in plain sight. The mineshaft wasn't just deep, it was endless, the kind of dark that swallows more than light. It swallowed names, faces, entire lives. They found the first set of bones, less than 4 feet in, tattered leather. rusted buckles, a shattered lantern, and teeth still gritted in the skull of a man who'd died afraid. The sheriff's team didn't speak. They just kept digging. The soil gave way like it had been waiting, like it wanted to be exposed by sundown. 6 sets of remains had been pulled out, some partial, some complete, each one with something: a coin purse, a pipe, a notebook, a boot with initials carved into the sole. Things no one could fake, things the girls had described days earlier, back in Pine Hollow. Judge Harrison stood before the congregation inside the very church whose walls had absorbed 16 years of rot, and with a voice like thunder behind stone, he said the words they all feared: "This settlement is founded on murder." Gasps, sobs, but no denials. No one could argue anymore, not with bones on the table, not with a child who described a silver locket that hadn't seen daylight in 2 decades. The church had stolen from men who passed through in good faith, killed them, stripped their corpses, and built a sanctuary with their blood. And then when the truth risked surfacing, they buried it again, in the walls, in the sermons, in the silence of an entire town. The Morrison twins stood before Judge Harrison as he asked the impossible. "How do you know all this?" Rebecca didn't blink. "We don't," she said. "They do." "Who?" "The ones no one listened to." There was no theater in their words, no hysteria, just a terrifying clarity, like a mirror that doesn't lie. Ezekiel Morrison, their father, stepped forward, his face weathered by years of walking from broken town to broken town. "I tried to protect them," he said. "Tried to pray it away, but the dreams always come." He looked at the judge, then the crowd. "They don't seek this out. The dead find them." Rachel nodded. "Especially the ones who died unjust." That word, unjust, it carried more weight in that moment than scripture, because what happened in Pine Hollow wasn't survival. It wasn't desperation. It was a choice to kill, a choice to lie, a choice to forget. And now, those choices had returned, wearing the voices of 2 little girls. Judge Harrison moved to declare formal charges. The sheriff read names. The accused didn't argue. They just cried. But the most chilling moment of the entire trial came next. Rebecca stood again. "There's more under the church," she said. "Not just bones." "Then what?" the judge asked. She turned her eyes toward the altar. Voices. Pastor Philip staggered back. He'd heard them, too. In his dreams, in the silence after midnight prayer. Children crying, a woman whispering, the sound of fire, but no flames. And now he knew. They were real, Rachel added. The voices stay until they're heard, until someone tells the truth. And that was when the judge made the call. The church floor would be torn up every inch, every stone. Nothing sacred until every lie had been removed. The sheriff's men began to dig, and under the altar, where prayers had been whispered for years, they found something wrapped in cloth, a baby's blanket. Inside it, the bones of the unborn. They hadn't been buried properly. They hadn't been named. They'd been stuffed into the dirt like afterthoughts, like mistakes. Rebecca wept. "They were supposed to live," she whispered. "Faith and hope. And now, so did everyone else." These weren't ghost stories anymore. They were indictments. Every wall, every hymn, every Sunday sermon was built atop a grave. When they pulled the bones of the unborn from beneath the altar, the cries weren't just from the congregation. Something shifted in the room. The walls groaned, the rafters creaked, and for just a moment, the light from the stained glass twisted, like the sun itself recoiled. Because this wasn't just a secret anymore, it was a curse. Judge Harrison stood in silence as the remains were carried out in a white cloth. No one moved. No one dared speak. Even the children in the pews were frozen, like they understood instinctively what the adults had long denied. The church wasn't haunted. It was guilty. Elder Thompson collapsed, not from age, but from shame. For the first time since the confessions began, he spoke not to the judge, but to the dead. Faith, hope, I see you now. His voice cracked. I hear you now. Rachel walked to his side, knelt, laid her hand on his shoulder. They already forgave you, she said, but the land hasn't. That line hit like a hammer to the chest, because the sickness in the soil, the dead patches in every garden, the way nothing green ever grew right around the church. It wasn't just bad luck, it was memory. The land remembers, and so do the bones buried in it. Pastor Phillips finally stood, the man once tasked with shepherding this flock, and spoke the words none of them ever thought they'd hear. We must tear it all down. There were gasps. Some cried out, but most just nodded. They understood now. You can't bless a place that was built with stolen blood. You can't pray your way out of a deal you made with silence. Not when the voices of children echo louder than the hymns. The decision was unanimous. The church would be dismantled board by board, stone by stone. It wouldn't be burned, too sacred, too profane. It would be taken apart slowly, like an autopsy, so the truth could be honored. They didn't stop there. The community itself, Pine Hollow, would dissolve. The land sold, the money sent to the families of the victims, the graves marked, the stories told. No more pretending, no more hiding, and as the last vote was cast, Rebecca and Rachel walked quietly out of the church, their hands clasped, their eyes vacant. Are they gone now? Rachel asked. Rebecca nodded, almost. The judge approached Ezekiel, his voice softer now. What are they? The father hesitated, then answered. Not like a preacher, but like a man who'd seen the edge of the world and returned half broken. They're mirrors, he said, not of what we see, but of what we refuse to see. The judge asked what everyone was thinking. Are they safe? Ezekiel shook his head. They're not here to be safe. They're here to remind us. What we bury never stays buried. He gathered his daughters close, and as they walked down the hill, away from the church that would soon be torn down, the wind carried a sound that no one could explain. Children's laughter, not Rachel, not Rebecca, but two other voices, younger, softer, free. Faith and hope had been heard, and now they could rest. But as the family passed the edge of the cemetery, Rebecca turned her head just slightly. There are more places, she said. Other voices, Rachel nodded. We'll hear them soon. And in that moment, one thing became clear. This wasn't an ending. It was just one chapter in a far older story. Because every town has its ghosts, every altar has its shadow, and every man has something he's been running from. You can tear down a church, but you can't undo truth. You can only decide whether to listen or wait for the reckoning to come. They dismantled the church in silence. Each board, each stone, removed like a rib from a long-dead giant. The altar was the last to fall. It groaned as it came loose, like it was resisting like it knew, and, beneath it, where they'd already found the bones of the unborn, they found something else. A rusted knife, its handle etched with the initials J.W. and a blood-stained cloth. Still faintly pink, despite the passing of 16 winters. It was the knife Jacob Whitman had carried, the cloth wrapped around his hand the night he bled, trying to protect his daughters. The congregation froze, not because of the object, but because of the message. This wasn't just evidence, it was a witness. The rot hadn't started in the walls, or the grave, or the money. It started in the heart, the decision to silence a man trying to tell the truth. That was the first seed. Every lie after was just fertilizer. Pastor Phillips stood over the hollow where the altar had once been, where so many confessions had been spoken, where so many truths had been ignored. How did we not feel it? He whispered. All these years, Rebecca answered without looking up. You did feel it. You just got used to it. That's how rot works. Slowly, quietly, it becomes part of the structure, until no one notices, until you breathe it. Speak it. Build your life around The mine shaft yielded more bodies. Men with names, families, futures, and every one of them, remembered by the girls. Their details weren't vague. They spoke of how each man died, what he was carrying, the names of loved ones, he whispered with his last breath, and the townspeople could no longer deny what had happened. This wasn't the sin of 3 men. This was an entire system. The lie wasn't in the act. It was in the in the silence. In the sermons preached with eyes shut and ears closed. That's what Pine Hollow had become. A monument to willful ignorance, so they erased it. The town was disbanded. The homes sold. The land turned over to the state, who ordered a full investigation and compensation for the families of the murdered travelers. Judge Harrison filed a 47-page report that would become legend in Kentucky's legal archives. But none of it explained the girls. No. Law could know. Science would. The twins didn't return for questioning. They didn't ask for reward. They simply walked on, hand in hand with their father, toward the next town, the next secret, the next unspoken name waiting to be said. And that's what disturbed the judge more than anything. It wasn't that the girls had uncovered a horror. It was that they acted like they'd done it before, like this was just one more graveyard in a long trail of them, one more town sleeping soundly over the bones of men they swore didn't exist, one more church where the stained glass was meant to filter the truth, not reflect it. Because this isn't about Pine Hollow. It's about all of us. The quiet family secrets. The old land deals no one talks about. The schoolhouse that burned down without explanation. The creek where the wrong kid drowned. They told us the past stays buried. They were wrong. The past grows. It spreads. Roots itself in our rituals, our myths, our institutions, until one day, 2 little girls show up in worn boots and whisper the truth we've forgotten how to hear. And when that happens, you don't just tear down a church, you tear down yourself. Because every man has an altar in his mind, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the voices calling out beneath it. Pine Hollow is gone now, its name erased from signs, its church dismantled, its history rewritten to something clean, quiet, and respectable. But that's the lie, isn't it? Towns don't disappear because of weather or economics. They vanish because someone needs them to. But Rebecca and Rachel, they remember. They always do. Because the map isn't made of roads or rivers. It's made of crimes, buried ones, ritual ones. The kind that happen behind closed doors, beneath respected titles, under the watch of people too afraid to ask the right questions. After Pine Hollow fell, the Morrison family kept walking, through valleys, across state lines, into towns no one talks about unless you were born there, and even then, only in whispers. And every time they arrived, the pattern repeated. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't promise salvation. They just listened, and the land spoke. The girls never needed to be told where the cemetery was. They always knew. They never needed directions to a cellar. No one opened since the war. They went straight to it. They never asked questions. They answered them. Where did my father disappear? In the well behind the mill. He fought back. They didn't bury the knife deep enough. Why did my brother change after the fire? Because he saw something no one believed. Who keeps opening the window in my daughter's room? She never closed it. She's trying to leave. And with each answer, a community changed. Some repented. Others resisted. But the girls never forced anything. They never cursed, never judged. They just told the truth. That was enough. Because the truth, once spoken, spreads like rot through old wood. Quiet, inescapable, fatal. And when the rot is exposed, it brings collapse, but also clarity. That's why some feared them. Not because they were evil. Because they were proof. Proof that what we bury, in land, in law, in family, never stays hidden. It waits it, festers, and it chooses a voice when it's time to rise. The judge, who dismantled Pine Hollow Harrison, never recovered from what he witnessed. He retired, quietly, moved to Tennessee, wrote one final legal essay that was never published, only found after his death. In it, he wrote, "Some children are born into history. These two were born outside of it. They are not from the future. They are not from the past. They are from the wound, and they speak for the blood still weeping from it. No one has been able to explain them. Not priests, not doctors, not scientists, but there's a pattern. The towns they visit never forget them, because those towns change, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later, but always permanently, because once the truth enters a place, the rot can no longer hide, and the dead, they stop whispering, because someone finally heard them. You see, you can build your life on silence. You can pray over the pain, preach over the bones, pour concrete over memory. But one day, someone's daughter will wake up screaming, and when you ask her why, she'll say, the ground remembers. The question isn't whether what happened in Pine Hollow was real. The question is, where is the next Pine Hollow? Where is your church built on secrets? Where is your altar standing above a grave? And what will you do when the voices finally speak? The final collapse of Pine Hollow wasn't a loud thing. It was a whisper, the kind that comes after truth does its work. The buildings came down, the earth was turned, and the graves, the real ones, the hidden ones, were finally marked. But the town, the legacy, it never healed, because some wounds aren't meant to close. They're meant to stay open, reminders, warnings. Pastor Phillips left quietly. He built no new church, took no pulpit. Instead, he spent his days tracing the same roads the Morrisons had walked, not to lead, but to listen. He never saw the girls again, but he never stopped feeling them, like echoes in the woods, like breath on the back of his neck when he stood alone in a place with too much silence. Ezekiel and the twins, they moved on, but not because the story was finished, because it never is. In a town outside Ashland, they stayed only 2 days, but when they left, a family finally confessed what had happened to their maid in the storm cellar back in 1809, in Tennessee. They passed through a village where no one spoke after sundown. By dawn, 2 widows had dug up a tin box filled with letters, and 1 gold tooth. In Georgia, they whispered to a child who hadn't spoken in 5 years. She said 1 word before they left: water. Later, they found the well, and the bones. The girls didn't need maps. They were maps, and each time they left, something broke, and something was rebuilt. Not a church, not a town, a reckoning. 1 man, a writer, followed them. He kept notes, tried to make sense of what he saw. Eventually, he wrote a single sentence in the margin of his journal: "They are not prophets. They are not cursed. They are the consequence." Because what Rachel and Rebecca carried wasn't just knowledge, it was judgment. Not the kind handed down by courts, not even the kind found in Scripture, but the kind that rises from the soil, when it's soaked in the blood of the forgotten. The kind that walks in boots too small, holding hands too tightly, with eyes to knowing for 9-year-old girls. And if you ever see them, if they come to your town, don't ask why they're here. Ask what your town has forgotten. Because the dead don't forget, they just wait. And the Morrison twins, they are the ones who listen. Years later, a box arrived at the Kentucky State Archives. No return address, no sender. Inside was a journal, leather, weather-worn. The name etched faintly on the cover: Ezekiel Morrison. It contained page after page of towns, dates, names, and at the very end, 1 final entry, written not by Ezekiel, but in a different hand, smaller, slanted. Rebecca's. Some people are born to forget. Others are born to remember. We were born to remind. The dead are never gone. They are just waiting for someone brave enough to speak their names. And then in red ink, underlined twice: truth doesn't knock, it walks in. That journal now sits in a locked drawer. Only a few have read it. But those who have changed, they look differently at old churches, at abandoned wells. At the attic, no one opens anymore, and in the Appalachian Hills, they say sometimes, just before the mist rolls in, you can hear the sound of two girls singing, a lullaby no one taught them, in a language no one remembers, with words that make grown men cry without knowing why. Because deep down, we all know truth comes for everyone, not in fire, not in thunder, but in footsteps, soft, bare, unstoppable, like the Morrison twins, like the children of the wound. And now, if you've made it this far, comment the words, "Truth doesn't knock, it walks in." Write it twice, one for the living, one for the dead. Because if you feel something stirring inside you right now, if the hair on your arms is standing up, then maybe some part of you already knows. The voices never really left, they've just been waiting for you.